Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Newsroom Live. I'm Stephanie Manning, and I'm here tonight on behalf of the 227 employees of the Portland Press Herald to say thank you, especially in light of tonight's topic and the freedoms we enjoy as Americans and Mainers. Your support of our work has never meant more. Tonight's audience is made up of our loyal subscribers and some special guests who are considering a subscription. I'm hoping that during the course of tonight's event that our subscribers won't mind helping me do my job by sharing in the chat the #1 reason why you subscribe to your local newspaper. I thank you in advance for doing that. Events like tonight are not only a benefit to your subscription, but also make it possible for us to bring it to our community. We're privileged to be able to do so. Leading tonight's discussion on Russia invades Ukraine is Colin Woodard, state and national affairs writer for the Portland Press Herald. In the 90s, Colin covered Russia and Eastern Europe as a foreign correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor and the San Francisco Monitor. Joining Colin is Laura Henry, a professor of government at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, where she teaches courses on contemporary Russian politics, Eastern Europe, and East European civil society. She is an expert on state-society relations in Vladimir Putin's Russia, the subject of several of her books. Also joining the discussion is James Richter, a professor of politics at Bates College in Lewiston. His early research focused on the domestic politics of Soviet and Russian foreign policy. He teaches courses in international politics and great power politics, and his current research focuses on how East European elites use history to frame and justify contemporary political agendas. I cannot think of 3 better Mainers to engage with us on this topic. Colin, thank you for pulling the panel together. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thank you, James Richter and Laura Henry, for joining us, and to all of you in the audience for joining this Newsroom Live on this very important event. Russia launched its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. That's less than 2 weeks ago, creating what's been the largest war in Europe since 1945 and the largest humanitarian and refugee crisis so far in the 21st century. So let's step right into it. Jim Richter, how does Vladimir Putin look upon Ukraine and on Ukrainian nationhood? And what role do you think those attitudes played in his decision to launch the war and to justify this conflict?
Yes, first of all, Colin, I want to thank you for organizing this and for inviting me. This is a real privilege to be here. And I think it's a responsibility to talk about it and everything like that. So thank you very much. As far as Putin's attitude towards Ukraine, I think it was John Kerry who said that Putin had a 19th century vision of global power politics in the 21st century. And I think there's a lot to that. Putin's vision is a world where great powers basically call the shots, and they have their spheres of influence where they have privileged entitlements to act as they please, and the smaller countries and smaller nations really don't have much of a say in the matter. So I think that that's very true. We also know that Putin always regretted the collapse of the Soviet Union, saying it was the greatest catastrophe in the 20th century, and that he considers the territory of the former Soviet Union as part of Russia's sphere of influence. And Ukraine is particularly important in this vision. It was a crucial part of the Soviet Union, supplying much of its agricultural produce, as well as much of its industry, and especially the military industry in the Donetsk and Luhansk areas. There are also lots of relatives. They speak a similar language. Many people in Ukraine actually speak Russian as their first language. And so Ukraine is even more than that, more than just a pawn in a great power. For many Russians, at least until recently, Ukraine was considered part of Russia. That is not really a separate state, as a Russian little brother. They both trace their roots to the Kievan Rus in the 900s, when Vladimir the Great converted to Christianity, to Orthodoxy. In the late 1800s, much of what is now Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, which began a process of Russification, trying to make the Ukrainians like little Russians. And more recently, And Stalin did the same thing. And then more recently, Putin has become almost obsessed with this idea of the historic Russian Empire. He's talked a lot about the 1,000 years of Russian history, starting with the conversion to Orthodoxy. And the problem is if you don't conclude Ukraine in that, you don't get 1,000 years, you get 600 years or something like that. So that's a real problem. He cannot make that claim. So in this summer, he actually published an article which explained in depth why he felt that Ukraine was not really a nation, it was an artificial nation, and therefore was really part of Russia. Meanwhile, those who oppose that claim, who oppose the claim that there was a natural affinity, they're usually seen as fascists now. They're seen as sort of supporters of Bandera, a Ukrainian nationalist who sided with Hitler in the early part of World War II, and also some other brutal Ukrainian national organizations in the 30s and 40s. So I think that this three things: A, Russia is a great power, it has entitlement, Ukraine is not really a country, and those who don't agree with that are fascists and enemies. That all creates a mindset which makes it, I don't say it's the ultimate cause, but it makes it possible in his head to justify it.
And so the implication of that worldview is that he believes ultimately Ukraine should be somehow part of a Russia or a Russia plus or a Russian empire of some sort, and this invasion is a means to achieve that?
I don't think he had in mind. I mean, he did threaten Ukrainian statehood recently, and which I assume is what he means. But I think what he had in mind is just making sure that whoever was in charge in Kiev was beholden to Russia and would do what Russia wanted in domestic politics as well as foreign politics. He wanted a subordinate country.
Laura Henry, this war would appear to be, a disaster for both countries, really. I mean, for Ukraine, for the really obvious reasons: cities destroyed, civilians being killed, a humanitarian nightmare on many cities at this moment, an authoritarian neighbor seeking to wipe out your country and cause it to disappear from the map. But is it not also a bit of a catastrophe for Russia and Russians as well, in terms of world standing, its economy, its soft power and influence in the world, its relations with its neighbors, the reputation of its military, and so on? What's your take on what this is meaning for Russia and Russians?
Thank you, Colin. That's a great question. I just want to echo Jim's thanks. I'm really happy to be here and so excited that hundreds of Mainers want to get together on a Tuesday evening to have these conversations. It is a catastrophe. It's obviously a catastrophe for Ukraine, and that's rightly where most of our attention should go. But it is a catastrophe for Russia as well. If we think about, any country, regardless of ideology, in general, the leadership of that country wants to have security, prosperity, stability, influence over regional neighbors, influence internationally. And one of the reasons that so many experts never thought this invasion would happen is because it is so incredibly costly by all of those measures, right? So Russia is facing possible economic collapse, certainly economic crisis, a deep recession at a minimum, and some parts of the economy basically incapable of functioning due to sanctions. Russia also is facing a potential threat to domestic legitimacy and stability. Now, I'm not saying that I think that Putin's going to be overthrown. That's something we could talk about later. But this is a regime that's increasingly going to have to use repression in order to manage certain segments of its population, right? The Russian military, which has been professionalized and modernized and given new technology, isn't performing gloriously as intended, which is also a concern. But even more consequential, this conflict has united the West in ways that we haven't seen for decades, which is really remarkable. NATO, the European Union, it's caused an outpouring of sympathy for Ukrainians. And it's causing increasing anti-Russian sentiment that kind of goes beyond sort of what governments are actually attempting to prompt. So, and finally, I would say it's turned generations of Ukrainians against Russia, no matter what the outcome is. So there's an interesting way in which Russia could potentially win, quote unquote. We could talk about what that means. this war, but lose in almost every other way. Now, there's a lot of give in what I just said. We don't know what's going to emerge from the Russia-China alliance. We don't know how durable public support for the war is going to be in Russia. We don't know if the West will hang together as energy prices rise and there are different pressures on democratic regimes. But so far, it looks truly like a catastrophe for Russia, but also for the Russian people.
I mean, you've studied Russian civil society for many years. I mean, what's your sense of how much ordinary Russians know about the reality of what Putin and their military are doing in Ukraine right now? And if they're opposed to that or don't like it, is there really anything they can do about it, given the dictatorial nature of the country and increasingly so?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I just want to pause quick and acknowledge the incredible resilience of Ukrainian civil society, right? The people who are delivering aid, overseeing evacuations, providing information, running the web pages, keeping basic services up and running, right? That's really remarkable. And I also want to clearly note that when we talk about Russian civil society, it's really important for all of us to remember that the Russian government is not the Russian people, the same way the United States government is not sort of all Americans, right? Many Russians have bravely come out to protest this war. I think the most recent data I saw is more than 13,000 have been arrested since the war began. But in the same time that Ukrainian civil society has been growing and becoming more resilient, Russian civil society for years has been under threat. And increasingly, I think since 2018, its sources of funding, its sources of information, its status, its ability to organize, its ability to advocate has really been under pressure from the regime. And, you know, this leaves Russian civil society in a really, really difficult situation, especially in Russia's information environment. So we know that all of Russia's television stations, major television stations, are owned by the state, as well as the other major media outlets, radio and television. And those outlets are telling people that the Russian military is engaged in an absolutely essential peacekeeping operation to deliver humanitarian aid, to protect a genocide against ethnic Russians, against a regime filled with Nazi sympathizers. And this media environment really affects people. So I don't think we can really trust the polling data that's coming out right now. First of all, it's the start of a conflict. But we do see actually that although there's general support for the war, it's not as high as it was for the annexation of Crimea, for example. So the Washington Post came out with a poll today saying 58% of Russians support the invasion, which is pretty low for the second week. Young people are the least likely to support the invasion, and it's because many of them get their news from the internet. This is a fraught moment for them as well. The Russian government is blocking some services, Facebook, slowing down others, Twitter, threatening others, TikTok. And then we see, in addition to Russian pressure, that many companies from the West are voluntarily deciding to leave Russia. Apple, Microsoft, some of the big internet service providers. And so it's getting more difficult to access internet resources in Russia for reasons that originate both inside the country and outside the country. And this is difficult because I think we do need to keep the lines of communication open to offer a different media context to those who desire it. And so that's going to be a tricky balancing act in weeks to come.
Jim Richter, what do you think if Russians everywhere knew the full truth of what was going on, would it make any difference? I mean, do you think there'd be if there were widespread opposition to the war, would there be any possibility of that somehow leading to a change in leadership in Russia? I mean, lately in social media, we've been seeing these, pictures, these sort of fascistic images of, lots of Russians standing in groups with the Z, which isn't a letter in Russian, but is being adopted because it's the symbol that's been put on the invading armor and vehicles heading into Ukraine, sort of as a symbol of support. Do you have any sense of that? And is there a possibility of instability from below for Putin in reaction to this, were the truth to be known?
I mean, I don't have a lot of insight. My sense is that, as Laura said, there have been a lot of people who have been arrested for protesting. and it's really important to know that protesting in Russia is a very costly activity. It's a very heroic activity. They could be looking for, several years in a Russian prison, away from their families, away from this, and that's nothing to sneeze at. And so, the fact that they're willing to do that, to take that risk, is really important. My sense is, in general, and again, I agree with Laura, what she said about the polls saying the support is there, but it's not great. My sense is that Russians actually have a distaste and aversion to war that's greater than, say, in the United States, because they all have had experience, either not direct perhaps, but certainly they've known grandparents who have had experience and stuff like that. So they know what war is. A lot of them are, from what I gather, are saying, well, yes, it's terrible, but we have to do it because Putin has brought on this vision of the United States and the fascists. So to the extent that they believe that, they're willing to accept war. So I think if they were told that they were lied to throughout, that would have something of a difference. I mean, they've been in economic straits for a while, so this is going to make it worse. So, I don't want, it's hard to say in a hypothetical like that, but I can't believe that they would support it to the same extent. Whether it would be an uprising that would remove Putin is, I think, a separate question. And because right now I don't see anybody who would replace him, because Putin has done a very good job at removing anybody who has an independent idea around him. I have heard rumors of some of the Siloviki, the other, people from the FSB and stuff like that, who which is the Secret Service and the military, who are upset at the war. But in order to arrange something if there's a huge uprising, they may take that as they may try to save their own skins by trying to remove him. However, it doesn't mean anything will get better for the Russians. It may mean they may have peace. They may allow them to sue for peace if that's what they want to do, but who knows?
But it's not like there's a Politburo anymore that can get together and say, hey, Mr. Gorbachev, your time's up, the car's outside. It's pretty much, you'd have to have a sort of revolutionary moment to change leaders now, yes, unlike the Soviet period.
You would have to have them all get together and be able to, first of all, you would have to make sure that everybody was on the same side, which is difficult. And then you'd have to have somebody who has the guts to organize it. Mm-hmm. So there are two steps, both of which are very difficult. So, but if there's a large, I think of Ceausescu as a possible predecessor, that I think that model. But again, in the near term, it didn't really help the Romanians.
Switching perspectives, Jim, what's been going on in Ukraine over the past decade or so, and how have those developments earned Putin's hostility towards Ukraine and its aspirations?
Well, a couple things. One thing to remember, though, is that Putin does not see a lot of agency for the Ukrainians, so he's really upset at the United States. And a lot of it has to do with what the United States is doing, what he thinks the United States is doing. So you had, so right after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukrainians voted 91% for independence. But that was complicated. It wasn't clear. I mean, it meant a lot of different things, not just what we think it does. But since then, for a long time, they had a very corrupt government, a government that was closely tied to Russian business interests, Russian government and everything like that. And then in 2004, there was a revolution against somebody who was sympathetic to Russia, sympathetic to those interests. The Ukrainian people were kind of tired of the corruption. They thought that they voted against it. They were pretty sure, and I think they were right, that there was a lot of corruption and rigging in there. They had a revolution. With pressure, Yanukovych agreed. There was a new election, and Yanukovych, who was the candidate from what is the Russian area, lost. And so you had a more Western candidate, but he wasn't that much better. And so there was still corruption. So in 6 years, you had another election and Yanukovych came back. And also there was a place
With Paul Manafort's help, right?
What? Yes,
With Paul Manafort's help.
Yes,
right?
he had to have an image scrub. So, and so one thing that's happened since 2014, when there was this, again, Putin was pressuring Yanukovych to join the Eurasian Economic Union, which was something that was centered around Moscow. A lot of people wanted to become an associate member of the EU, not necessarily because they were pro-Western, but because they thought that might decrease the corruption, I think, more than anything else. And Putin put a lot of pressure on Yanukovych. Yanukovych went through it. There were demonstrations. They kind of died down. As soon as they died down, Yanukovych tried to stifle them with force. That got everybody angry again. They came back up. This happened a couple times. And then you had a revolution where it got violent and Yanukovych had to leave.
The Maidan, right?
What?
The Maidan.
Yes, the Maidan in 2014. And that's after which Putin took Crimea and helped start the war in Donetsk and Luhansk. So, but since then, something amazing has happened in that if you look at the polling, so there have always been a lot of people who spoke Russian, and before that they often identified more with their region in Ukraine rather than the state of Ukraine. But since then, all the polling shows that more and more people, even the Russian speakers, even the ethnic Russians, say, for my nationality, I'm Ukrainian. And the Ukrainian government has been trying to build its nationhood through various ways, some good, some not so good, with various laws. One is decommunization, taking down all the statues of Lenin. But it's kind of difficult because symbols of communism are everywhere there because they were under colonialist rule for some time. And also these language laws, which were designed to sort of restrict the use of language in publications, in schools, and in movies and stuff like that. And that's something that I think
restrict the use of the Russian minorities language in some of those contexts, right?
Right, and I think that Putin saw that was some of the pretext that Putin said to describe, genocide and things like that.
So in the broad sense, there was sort of there developed sort of pro-Russian and Ukrainian factions that sort of fought it out. Both were corrupt, but in the end, there was sort of a rising to throw out corruption and to throw out Moscow at the same time, and a consolidation of a Ukrainian sense of nationhood, whether you were Russian or Ukrainian, following Russia's annexation of Crimea and intervention in the East?
I think that if Putin didn't do what he did in 2014, it may not have been such an anti-Russian thing. I mean, if you look at the polls about NATO, only 25% of Ukrainians in 2013 wanted to join NATO. Now it's about 70. Actually, probably now it's closer to 80 or 90. But, I don't know. I mean, I think there were a lot of people who had a lot of different ideas, but I think 2014, again, as Laura said about this time, it pushed people away. It created more pro-Ukrainian feeling.
Laura, what's been the United States and the European Union's stance towards Ukraine during all of these events of this time period we just talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if we look just at the recent past, we can see that the war in Ukraine has really reinvigorated and reunited the Western alliance system under NATO and the European Union. And this is following the Trump presidency and Brexit, which sowed a lot of discord in both of these, both NATO and the EU. But if we look over the period of time that Jim is talking about, really from 2004 to the present, we can see a kind of complicated ambivalence about the Ukrainians, right? On the one hand, the assertion that every state is sovereign and can decide if it wants to apply to join a club, if it wants to apply to join NATO, if it wants to apply to join the European Union, and even George Bush sort of encouraging Ukraine to think about in the long-term future joining NATO at some point during his presidency, George W. Bush. However, they were always aware, the kind of people who run the EU and NATO, that it would be very difficult to digest Ukraine as a member. And many of the professional military people who staff NATO had no desire to see Ukraine become a member because they did not believe they could come to the defense of NATO. They did not believe they could uphold an Article 5 treaty obligation with a state that has such a long border with Russia and such a close history. The EU had a more measured approach. It had this idea of partnership, association, decades in which they would advise the Ukrainians, students could study, maybe some short-term work visas, not full membership. But we are now living in warp speed. I mean, things are changing under our feet, and it's really hard to know kind of where Ukraine will end up in terms of these two alliances. On the one hand, it is absolutely remarkable the way that the US and the EU have worked together, even kind of a good cop, bad cop diplomacy with Macron going to Moscow, Schultz, Boris Johnson, right? And then Biden at home making the pronouncements. And we see a lot of log jams have been broken inside both of these alliance systems. So in the EU, debates that have been going on for years about energy, about military, about refugees, suddenly, hour by hour, new policies are being articulated almost faster than you can keep up. Today, the announcement that they would try to reduce their dependence on Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of the year. They were talking about reduce it by 2030, right? Just yesterday. And NATO, similarly, I mean, the best example of it is Germany, right? Germany, not wanting to spend its money on defense, very ambivalent about military power based on its history. Suddenly, yes, they're going to spend 2% on military budget, 2% of GDP, as Obama asked, as George W. Bush asked, as Trump asked, and they're going to start with $100 billion infusion of cash. And they're giving weapons to the Ukrainians. I mean, this is hour by hour, these systems are shifting. Now, Ukraine has asked to become a member of the EU. And the reality is that that is a decades-long process. And any agreement on the EU side at this point would be almost purely symbolic. They would be put on a track to membership, but I'm sure they would be looking 20, 30 years down the road, right? But the idea would be to give the Ukrainians some hope. Will it happen? All 27 member states of the European Union have to agree, and that it seems unlikely, but a lot of things that seemed unlikely last week have happened, so I hesitate to make any predictions.
Right, to have the Swiss banking community take a side is that doesn't happen very often.
Exactly.
I mean, here's the big question. Why do you think, Laura, that Putin decided to launch this invasion now? I mean, why at this particular moment? I mean, you had 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House, who presumably would have been an advantageous interlocutor compared to Joe Biden, all kinds of other factors out there. Do you have any idea why it was this moment? Or your
well, I think
guess?
Yeah, we all have to be careful about trying to get inside Putin's head. I mean, we just don't know, right? And so, but we can kind of try to make predictions based or analysis based on some signals from the past. So there is an argument that Vladimir Putin's reading of the situation was that the West was in disarray, that the Trump presidency, the contestation over the 2020 election and sort of the polarization around that election, Brexit, Angela Merkel leaving as kind of the symbolic and in many ways practical leader of the European Union. And then maybe, the kind of war in Afghanistan and definitely the US decision to pivot to Asia, that, Europe wasn't going to be a priority anymore. Russia wasn't a priority anymore. It was all about China. There was a sense that maybe this is the moment. Maybe some people argue that Putin thought this is the last chance to really stake a claim, to try to draw Ukraine back in. But the reality is, it's hard to say. I mean, Putin has always had very different interests than we do in the West. But And he's always been willing to take calculated risks in order to achieve his goals. He's been a bit of an opportunist. But many of these positions were understandable in terms of like a kind of a cost benefit analysis. I think now what's happening is we see a lot of decisions made on the basis of emotion, identity, interpretations of history, and the kind of cost benefit analysis that we had been accustomed to definitely feels like it has shifted. Now, I heard somebody say the other day, it was actually Kimberly Martin, who's at Barnard and Columbia, said, being a rational actor is cost benefit analysis plus information. And one thing is that Putin is likely not getting very good information anymore, right? His expectations about Ukraine, his expectations about the reception of the Russian military in Ukraine, his analysis of what was going on in the West, part of the problem might just be the way in which he has really narrowed the number of advisors who have direct access to him. So it's definitely a difficult question to answer.
Do you concur, Jim, or do you have anything else to add on that particular question, the big question everyone's had?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Laura was just saying. I think there have been lots of arguments. I think the arguments which he argued about the possibility of the West being weaker or not being attentive, the fact that they couldn't get Europe together because Europe depended on Russian gas. Certainly the history arguments, I totally kind of get. The other thing is that I think he felt, first of all, I do think he was obsessed with this idea of the 1,000-year history, and he had just gotten control of Belarus. And so there was this, if you look at a map, Ukraine is like this projection into this area. So it was like a gap. It was a piece of the puzzle that he hadn't fit. And more than that, because Zelensky was doing things to strengthen, the Ukrainian nation, and I think he felt that, if he didn't act now, it wasn't going to be able to work later on. So I think it was partly a fear of losing Ukraine forever. But again, and I have to agree with Laura, we cannot get inside Putin's head. If you ask me, is he unhinged? I have no idea. I mean, I just clearly this was a terrible mistake and a terrible decision from his own point of view. But why he made it, certainly he was in a bubble. He's been isolated for COVID. I think it had all these things played a role in some way, and they just converged, but I don't know which is more important.
On February 27th, Putin placed his Russian nuclear forces on a higher state of alert than they had been, which raised concerns all over the world about the possibility of a nuclear war or some kind of, devastating confrontation between nuclear powers. What are each of your takes on what Putin's order meant and how much it really raised or elevated the risk of a, atomic cataclysm? Either of you.
Yeah, I mean, another one we don't really know, right, Jim?
Right.
I
go back and forth.
Exactly. It was definitely a rhetorical strategy to remind people that Russia's a nuclear power and that we push back against Russia, at our peril in terms of World War III. I think a lot of people who are military analysts didn't think it had a huge meaning. In some level, these forces are always on high alert. What actually matters is the movement of the nuclear material to the launching positions, which hasn't happened yet. And I'm sure the satellites are snapping photos every 30 seconds to see whether that might happen. I mean, the one thing that's disconcerting, there's several things that are disconcerting. One is just that many unexpected things have happened in the last couple of weeks. And so that kind of changes our calculus. The other thing is there is this element of the Russian military doctrine called escalate to de-escalate, which is if you feel that you're in a disadvantageous position, you should take a radical action to try to improve your leverage and your bargaining position before you actually, have to withdraw or to make a negotiated compromise or things like that. And so that's where people think, would it be possible just to kind of for the Russians to use a quote unquote tactical nuclear weapon, to contaminate one city, one region, to say, hey, this is what could happen. So what are you offering? I still think that's unlikely. There is still a chain of command. You don't actually push a red button and the missile takes off. There is like a whole series of actions. And I still hope actually that there are people who would kind of throw themselves in the way of something like that happening. I think a lot of Russians who know that there's a war that's going on are very ambivalent about what's happening to the Ukrainian people, who historically, they're extremely close culturally, historically, even kinship across families.
We'll start sort of segueing a bit towards audience questions, but one of the questions I had has been echoed in the audience a few times, and that's that if Putin did succeed in, say, overthrowing President Zelensky's government, do you think it's possible he might attack another country? Moldova, like Ukraine's a former Soviet republic with a section which has a Russian minority that, the Moscow has sort of propped up a pseudo sub-state, and they're not in NATO, so they couldn't count on that protection. You have other places that are in NATO, like the Baltic republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union and so on. Do you have any, again, we're trying to act as the Putin whisperers here, but do you have any sense of that from your expertise and watching him and the region so closely?
My sense is that this has been so bad that my sense, from a rational point of view, he's expending so much energy in trying to maintain Ukraine. It will take, I heard today that the estimates are, in order to occupy it, he will need 3 times as many troops there that he now has. And that would be extremely expensive. Now, Moldova is very small, so that he might be tempted under the right conditions, but it doesn't mean that as much to Putin. I think the Baltics, if anything is clear, is that he doesn't want to risk going into NATO because his army isn't as good as he thought it was. And NATO has shown that it probably will fight. It was always a question, will you trade Riga for New York? And the answer seems to be, yeah, it looks like they might. So, in that reason, I really don't see an expansion. Again, though, as Laura said, there are so many issues. One thing I am mildly worried about is, as this continues on and as we see the horrors that are going on and the suffering, the pressure for the US to do something like a no-fly zone, or in some ways get more militarily involved, would grow. And I think Biden has been clear that he doesn't want that, because I think the real threat of nuclear war is not that, as Laura said, is somebody's going to deliberately press the button or whatever. I think it is more that if you get into a place where miscalculations or miscommunications or lack of information by somebody who does have the ability to fire a nuclear weapon, that's where the real danger is. And so therefore it's really important to minimize the chances of miscalculation or miscommunication. And I have heard recounts of the building of a sort of a hotline to allow for that kind of thing, which I was very pleased to see. So, so I am more optimistic than I was 3 days ago about this.
I just jump in briefly and say, I think the thing that might happen with Moldova is that in Transnistria, the former Soviet army, figures who've been running that breakaway region, they might spontaneously decide that they see an opportunity to kind of join in or glom on to some greater Russia that they see. But otherwise, I agree, it's probably not worth the cost for Putin. The one thing I've been worried about, and I don't know if Jim agrees with me, but I've been a little bit worried about the way in which now so much of this aid from the US and the EU is coming in through Poland. Actually, Slovakia and Hungary have been very reluctant to have that shipped down their highways and railways. So it's coming in through Poland. There aren't that many routes from Poland into Ukraine. And it must be very tempting for the Russians to think if they could just strategically, bomb these sites before the material actually gets into Ukraine. Now, I imagine they would try to do that on the Ukrainian side of the border, but as Jim said, mistakes happen, miscommunications, misunderstandings. We've seen, this already. And so that causes me a few worries. I don't worry as much about the Baltics right now for the same reason that Jim articulated. Yeah.
That's an interesting point, because I read something today that a bunch of foreign policy people in Washington have suggested a possible limited no-fly zone just for those places in Ukraine where they would supply that kind of material and also the humanitarian aid and stuff like that and I don't know what to think about that. I mean, that's not my specialty, and I'm kind of worried about it, but because a no-fly zone may require to shoot down anti-aircraft weapons that are located in Belarus or something like that. So that was a possibility for escalation. But it is interesting that, some, including former Ambassador Vershbow to Moscow, has signed this letter asking for a limited no-fly zone in Western Ukraine for that very reason.
Audience member asks, says Putin watched the United States struggle to control Afghanistan and Iraq, and he knows the Soviet history in Afghanistan from the 1980 invasion. Surely he must know that he too will face years of insurgency in Ukraine, at least west of the Dnieper River, where it's majority Ukrainian. If any Ukrainians stay, that is. I know it's hard to get in his head, but what's your guess of what tactics he will use to ultimately control Ukraine? I guess that's a question about how he would succeed in occupying a occupied Ukraine.
Well, I mean, I think the thing you would logically have to do is partition, right? So he probably would never try to digest all of Ukraine, Western Ukraine. He might try to take sort of Kiev east and south, and then who knows about Odessa. I mean, this is all speculation, but that would still require hundreds of thousands of occupying forces, tremendous repression under constant threat of insurgency and guerrilla warfare, and probably a pretty serious purging of existing civil servants, educators. It's almost impossible to imagine that Russia could withstand the cost reputationally, militarily, economically. And I really think that they're probably furiously recalibrating in Moscow because of the expectation that a certain part of the country would indeed welcome Russian troops, which was a profound miscalculation based on very bad data and possibly some advisors telling Putin what he sort of preferred to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. The partition is quite possible. I think he really thought that, I think he thought that he could change the government and everything else would fall into place to some extent. I think he felt that, governments are in charge and this is the way, and most Ukrainians would accept Russian leadership. So I don't think he thought that far ahead, strangely. And it would be expensive that has the dumb thing to do with his denazification, is to do the purge. The US said there was a list of people. I'm sure now if he was going to do it, it would have to be many times longer because I think and you would have to think about the police forces and all the local places. What are you going to do with them? What are you going to do with the entire army, who are not going to switch sides, most of them? So I don't see how he can sustain an occupation.
Another reader asks, what role Ukraine's NATO aspirations or aspirations towards membership played in Putin's decision to invade. In other words, how imminent was NATO membership for Ukraine, in the months leading up to the invasion?
It was in no way imminent. If it was going to happen at all, it would have taken a long time. But the domestic rhetoric in Russia was very overheated about, Ukraine planning to station troops in, or NATO planning to station troops in Ukraine, to use it as a site for anti-Russian military installations. I mean, analysts debate. You could go into international relations conference right now, and you would get people having a furious debate about to what degree is this Ukraine the victim of a proxy conflict between NATO and Russia? And to what degree was Russia driven more by history, identity, emotion, the regathering of the Russian lands, or something in between, where it's not in Russia's interest to have a Western-oriented, democratic, more and more stable, more and more prosperous Ukraine on the border as a successful model of how a post-Soviet state could exist. And it's probably all of the above, but the weighting, how you allocate it, I don't think it's, as Jim said, the Ukrainians didn't want to join NATO until Russia began to nibble away at the country. So it's a problem that NATO is at the root of, but also Russian actions are also at the root of. So I don't kind of buy the argument that NATO is 100% responsible for this conflict.
Yeah, I don't buy that. It is true that there were NATO forces in exercises in Western Ukraine. So it wasn't a complete figment of Putin's imagination, but it was an exaggeration. And it was useful because one of the rhetorical tools that Putin has used to justify his own leadership is that the West was an enemy and that the US was trying to humiliate Russia. And that has been pretty constant since about 2004 in Putin's rhetoric.
Another reader asks what the impact of the conflict will be on Russian gas transiting Ukraine to Europe, where it's a major part of the energy supply in many countries that keeps homes warm and the like, and the related issue in energy of the capture and potential shutdown of Ukraine's nuclear electricity generating plants. I guess it's sort of a disruption to the world's energy supply and the way we do things kind of question for either of you.
Well, this is pretty much out of my bailiwick, but I can say, I mean, as Laura said, Germany has suggested that they would depend less on oil coming from Russia. Nord Stream has been canceled, which if Putin had just limited the incursion to Donetsk and Luhansk, probably wouldn't have happened. So things are happening. Fortunately, it's already, middle of March, so the heating is not as big an issue. I don't know. I mean, I think that the Europeans probably, at the same time, the Russians, of course, need that that money for the oil at the same time. And as far as the nuclear plants, I cannot pretend to offer any expertise on that.
The only thing I would add is that, Russia had been diversifying away from Ukraine as a transit route through Nord Stream. So Nord Stream 2 is canceled, but Nord Stream 1 continues, and then South Stream, which goes by Turkey.
Right.
And so there are alternative ways, but it's been very interesting to me to watch the military strategy unfold. And I've been of two minds about it. It seemed initially when Russia hoped to occupy, it actually didn't want to destroy certain key infrastructure. I think it didn't really want to destroy Kyiv, for example. And I think if you're going to run the country, you actually need those nuclear power plants to be providing electricity. Now, if the war goes more and more poorly and there's no chance that they'll occupy, they might become more willing to destroy. But I think so far at the early stage, it wasn't really in their interest, depending what they thought the outcome was, to destroy a possible route for selling oil and gas, and also to destroy infrastructure that would be necessary to actually run the country.
We've had a few questions from the audience that I guess circle around justice. One person asks, what is the jurisdiction and process for alleged war crimes committed during this invasion? Another person asking, what would reparations look like if the occupation fails, and so on? What are your thoughts on the suite of questions around, at some point, if there's an end game that doesn't have Ukraine absorbed into Russia, presumably the question of compensation, reparations, justice, war crimes, and all that will be sort of on the agenda. How do we unpack that when dealing with a very powerful nuclear armed adversary, or aggressor, I should say?
I think there is the International Criminal Court, right? And they've agreed to fast track a review of whether or not war crimes are happening in Ukraine right now. The thing about the court is it doesn't have much authority to actually imprison or extract fines from a country if it's not cooperating. And the European Court of Human Rights for years has been ruling against Russia, and they don't always pay or even abide by the actual rulings. So that's my first cut. My second cut would be something about the different opinions that we have about how we should treat Russia in the wake of this conflict. And I can pause on that because I'd love to hear what Jim thinks about this idea of war crimes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it really depends on how it ends. So if it is, I mean, I can see a group of people deciding to sort of sacrifice Putin himself or a few of the leaders, but I don't know. I don't, it would depend if it becomes a more democratic country which wants to join the international community. They might be more willing to do that. But otherwise, I think it would be very hard to demand that. And I'm not necessarily sure it would be totally in our interest. I think that if you look back to the 1990s, at that time, it was clear that the issue of the United States was we're going to win, we won. And I, at that time, thought that there had to be more consideration for Russia's sort of self-esteem to some extent, if you want to think of it as a person, but to some more opening to Russia. There was quite a bit, but I think that in some ways there were various ways in which the US foreign policy was trying to contain Russia from the very beginning. And that was clear in some of the policies, not just NATO, but towards the Black Sea and other things like that. And I really feel that that was a mistake to some extent, because I felt that it was going to just move the line that divided Europe further east. And so I would hope that it wouldn't be a punitive peace. They don't usually work very well, especially when you've got a country that size with nuclear weapons and that many people, et cetera. It just creates more problems down the line.
Looking a lot further east, I mean, one thing that people have been thinking about with the situation is, okay, if Russia is isolated from Western Europe, United States, Canada, its many Asian partners, really China becomes its alternate trading partner. Will there be an axis of authoritarians or something forming? So a lot of eyes have been looking to China. And one of the viewers here tonight has a following remark and question. Says, on Chinese state-sponsored news, CGTN, it was reported today that he said that the leader of China, this war is in the interest of no one. The audience member says this looks like a dramatic shift. Does China view Putin's failure as a possible destabilizing event for authoritarian states? I know you're not necessarily China watchers, but I thought that was an interesting question to throw out there.
Laura?
No, Jim, please, by all means.
I, as you mentioned, I'm teaching a course on great power politics, and one part of that is to read Chinese strategic thinkers. So when you think of, so the Chinese are pretty confident that they are going to continue to grow, that they are going to become more and more powerful, and that sooner or later they will have greater say in the international sphere. But their whole attitude, at least in their rhetoric, is that we want to do this peacefully. We want to recognize the sovereignty of other countries. We want to work within the norms. We're going to create, the Belt and Road Initiative in order to supplement the existing things, but that will bring more people to the Belt and Road Initiative. You're going to create an Asian investment bank. That's going to bring more people to Beijing's institutions away from the IMF. And pretty soon, the balance of the weight will shift from one side to another, or at least equalize so that China would be in a better condition to assert itself in various ways. But the whole idea is take your time, work within it. I'm not saying that China is a good country. I mean, it's clearly it is ambitious and it wants to have more say. So I think that Putin, from what I gather, what I've heard in different ways, there was a lot of speculation of whether actually Putin told Xi what he was going to do. I think it's clear that he did now suggest that there was going to be some sort of invasion, but I don't know if he told them the exact length of it. I'm sure the Chinese are very disappointed at or very concerned about the unification of the West. They're very concerned about and they're very concerned that the Russians aren't performing that well. And so I think that they're saying we may have backed the wrong horse, or at least we have to, I mean, from the very beginning, it was clear that China was in a difficult position. And as things move on, their position is getting even more difficult. So the fact that Xi Jinping would say something like that, I mean, he's been kind of edging along in that direction anyway. And I think he's going to try to distance himself. How far, I don't know. But the fact that he's moving a little bit away, I'm not terribly surprised by.
The only thing I would add to that is that I think that Russia's future as a Chinese ally is simply as a very small resource appendage to China's project. It's not a glorious future. Many people in Moscow, in foreign policy think tanks and universities really worry about that relationship because it is so deeply imbalanced. So in the long haul, it leaves Russia in a difficult place if their one and only ally or their primary ally is China.
Right. It has an economy 10 times bigger than theirs, is right. Not a partnership of equals. A few watchers asked variations of the question, you know, if you're, you know, on the side of Ukraine, what's the most effective way you can support the resistance effort, you know, help with the humanitarian crisis, that sort of feeling, I think, for a lot of people, of the helplessness of watching this unfold and wishing they could do something. What can people in Maine do about these things if they're concerned and motivated to try to do something?
It's a great question. There are a lot of very good charities out there. I would be a little bit wary of some of the crowdfunding and ones, but there are some. I gave a link to your administrator about the Kyiv Independent newspaper, and they've been advertising some different charities that are reputable, that are actually delivering services to people. So I would look there. I would listen to the Ukrainians and what they want. I mean, I think one of the most important things you could do is lobby the US government to allow for the resettlement, temporary or not so temporary, of Ukrainian refugees, to give them temporary protective status and to actually actively bring refugees to this country. And the other thing is to calm people down about oil and gas prices. I mean, we are in a crisis, a global crisis right now, and oil and gas prices are going to go up, and that's going to have unpredictable effects on American politics. And I think we need to kind of keep the conversation domestically, you know, balanced and with a multifaceted view. I mean, I think we're going to end up in a bit of a pickle, and I'll just tell you sort of something I see coming. Ukraine has always said no decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine. So the US can't get together with the EU, can't get together with Russia and make a decision what's going to happen to Ukraine. Ukraine gets to decide. But there's increasingly bifurcation in the Western foreign policy establishment. Some people say this is a disaster. We have to end it. We have to find an off-ramp. Putin has to be able to save face. We can't humiliate him. And we might have to do something drastic. We might have to give him Donetsk and Luhansk. We might have to force Ukraine to declare its neutrality, even against the wishes of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government. And then there are other people who say Ukrainians are standing up for democracy. Who are we if we don't support that? this is our moment to push decisively back against Russia, which I think risks some of the things that Jim was talking about a temporary resolution to the problem, but the seeds of a longer term conflict in the future. And I think there is no one right answer. And so this question of standing with the Ukrainians is going to be a really tricky question, kind of beyond kind of our solidarity with the Ukrainian people. But how do we support the Ukrainian government in the weeks to come? And what if we start to have interests that seemingly diverge from theirs? Oh, Colin, I
Jim,
think
do you have anything else to add to close out?
No, I think Laura ended it very well. Helping the refugees, I would say, is the most, and trying to make sure they come to the United States, that we offer this asylum for many from the United States in the United States is excellent as well. So,
Well, yeah.
A good way to end.
Laura Henry, Jim Richter, thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your insights on this important issue. And thank all of you in the audience for coming and joining. We had an enormous turnout, so obviously a lot of people care about this. If you enjoyed this evening and you're a subscriber to the Portland Press Herald, which most of you are, thank you very much. Please continue doing so. If you're on the fence, come support local journalism so we can bring you events like this and the reporting on Maine that helps keep our government and our people informed and accountable. Thank you all and have an excellent evening.